welcome back to another Stitch alphabet video. If you haven't seen any of the other ones in this series, we are on letter D now. So this is the inspiration behind this series. I was making a fabric book with a page for each letter of the alphabet, and on that page I've just done samplers of stitches that begin with that letter. So we have covered letter A, we have covered B stitches. Last time we looked at C stitches, so we looked at cross stitch, cast on stitch, couching, chain stitch, cable chain, what else can I find? Cretan stitch, chevron stitch, and colonial knots. I think that was what we covered. I think we also did Chinese knot as well, and coral stitch as well. So this time we are working on our D stitches, and I chose to stitch this page in orange because I did a poll on my Instagram and my followers voted for various colours, and orange was the one that was chosen. So there are some of my favourite stitches on here, and hopefully some new ones that you might not have come across before. So we've got a whole range of things on there. There's a couple of cheeky knots that don't really belong, but I use them anyway. And yeah, I think we're going to have some fun today. So I'm just going to stitch in a hoop with some pearl cotton. I'm going to stick with the orange for this one. So let's learn some stitches that begin with the letter D. Okay, I've put some natural linen in my hoop. I've got some orange pearl cotton threaded up in my needle. I use, I think it's a size 4 crewel needle, so I do like a chunkier needle, and ideally, I'm not a needle snob, but ideally you need a needle that is a similar thickness to the thread that you're using. The needle is going to open up the fabric and make space for the thread, so using a needle that is a little bit bigger will reduce wear on the thread as you're stitching. Thought we could start with something really straightforward. We looked at chain stitch last week, and so let's do a detached chain stitch. I've brought my thread through. I want to loop it around and take my needle back down the same hole where that thread came out, and I'm going to rock my needle forward so that it comes up inside that loop that I've made, and when I pull through, the loop will get caught on the working thread and form this little teardrop shape. Now normally with a chain stitch we would go down where the thread came up and repeat the process again, but with a detached chain stitch we're going to leave it by itself. So we need to anchor that loop, and the way we do that is to hop over the thread. So I'm taking my needle down right on the other side of the thread, tucking it in as close as I can, pull through, and that puts a little stitch over the bottom of that loop to hold it in place. So let me show you that again. I'm going to come up through the fabric, loop my thread round and go back down where that thread came out. Then I'm going to rock forward and bring my needle up inside that loop, pull through, then I'm going to hop over the thread of the loop at the bottom, and that puts a little anchor stitch in place. So that's detached chain stitch. Now we can play around with this a little bit because we don't have to make that anchor stitch really tiny. We can make something like a stem on the bottom of our detached chain stitch. So rather than just hopping over, we can put a straight stitch in to put a little stem on our stitch, and you can vary the size of your chain stitch compared to the size of the stem and create lots of really nice effects. Now Another way of varying this is to work them in a circle, and that creates a second stitch called daisy stitch, sometimes called lazy daisy. So I'm going to loop my thread around, go back in where that thread came up, rock forward inside my loop and pull through. So I'm working upwards this time. Then I'm going to anchor that stitch in place. Now what I'm going to do is work several of these in a circle, all springing from the same place. So I'm going to bring my needle up at the point that that stitch began. Going to work in a slightly different angle, and if you want to position your stitches ahead of time, you can just put some little lines in to show you where you're going. So I'm going to go back down at the centre again, rock my needle out, coming up inside the loop and pull through, hop over and put a little anchor stitch in place. So we come up at the centre again, go round in a loop and rock forward, hop over and put our anchor stitch in. Round in a loop, rock forward and a little anchor stitch, and then one last one in that space. And there you have daisy stitch. So we've got detached chain and daisy stitch. Another detached stitch that we can use is called Detached Fly Stitch. So we haven't learnt fly stitch yet, but this is a good start to learn the principles. So it's worked in a very similar way to detached chain stitch, but this time we're going to open out the top of the loop. So we bring our thread through, we're going to loop our thread round again and just come back through the fabric a little distance away from where it came up, so we've got an open top on our loop. We're going to come down and bring our needle back up inside that loop a little way down from the top of the stitch. So where those two thread springing points are, we're going to come down maybe a centimetre from that, pull through, and again our loop gets caught on the working thread, but this time because we've opened out the top it forms a little V shape, and just like before we're going to hop over that loop and put in a little anchor stitch at the bottom. So let me show you that again. So bring the needle through, loop the thread round, take the needle back down a little way across, horizontally across, and then on the back we're going to come down from the top of those two threads and bring our needle up inside that loop in between the prongs at the top of the loop, hop over to put a little anchor stitch in place, and that's detached fly stitch. And like detached chain stitch, we can play around and vary this, so we can make a very shallow stitch. So let's open it up quite wide and not drop down very far at all. We can still come up in the centre, so that makes a more shallow stitch. We could stitch them very close together, still open, and very long, so we can make a long narrow fly stitch like that. We can play around with angles, so we can make our fly stitch, but rather than coming up in the centre, we can come up to one side, and that makes a sort of offset fly stitch. And like with detached chain, we can also add a stem. So make our fly stitch in the normal way, but this time instead of just hopping over, we can put a little stalk on. And so there's loads of ways to play with detached fly stitch. You can also seed with this. So again, we haven't covered seed stitch in this series yet, but this works really nicely when you've got lots of little tiny fly stitches. Let's do a little tiny one to show you. All facing in different directions, used as a kind of fill. So really small, pointing in different directions and used to fill a space. Like that. So that's detached fly stitch. The more stitches we learn, the more we can play around with them, and it's possible, now we know these two stitches, to combine them into another stitch called Detached Wheatear stitch. So for this one, we start by making a fly stitch. So I've brought my thread through, I'm going to hop across, go back down through the fabric, and then come up in the middle as if I'm making a fly stitch. Instead of putting in my anchor stitch though, this time I'm going to make a chain stitch straight away. So I'm going to take my needle back down through that same hole so that I make a loop, pull through so that you can see it, and I'm going to come up inside that loop a little bit further down, pull through and catch that chain on my working thread, and then I can hop over, put my anchor stitch in place, and that's called a detached wheatear stitch. I'll show you that again. So come up through my fabric, hop across, come up in between those prongs a little way down, loop my thread around, go back down in the same place my thread is coming out of the fabric, down again, come up inside the loop, hop over to put an anchor stitch in place, and that is detached wheatear stitch. Now you can work these horizontally, you could work one facing this way, and if you want to you could put in between one going up the other way. This would make a really nice border, I think, like that. You can also make them working vertically. So let's make a little detached wheatear stitch. And then I'm going to use that stitch as a guide to form my next stitch. So I'm coming up directly below where my first fly stitch started, hopping across, and I'm going to make a fly stitch that sort of cups that previous stitch. And then the same again. So hop across, come up just below the bottom of the previous stitch, loop around, and catch the loop. So again, another way to make a nice decorative border. So that's detached Wheatear stitch. So we've covered a number of detached stitches. We're going to look at some double stitches now. So the first one we're going to do is based around this stitch here. This is a double chain stitch. So normally we would work chain stitch in a line. I've drawn these two parallel lines on because that's going to help me keep everything straight. So I'm going to bring my thread through on the left hand line. I'm going to go horizontally across and go down on the right hand line, pull into a loop, and I'm going to come up on the left hand line again about a centimetre down from where my thread first came through. So my needle's inside that loop and I'm going to pull through, and that's going to catch my working thread into V shape. So it's a bit like a fly stitch at the moment. So now I'm going to loop my thread back round and go back down at the point I took my needle down before. Alright, so let's call this A, B and C. We come up at A, we go down at B, we come up at C and we go back down at B. We pull through to make a loop, and this time we're going to come up at point D, and that is going to be down on the right hand line. So we've gone down a centimetre here, we're going to go down about another centimetre. So we want, you don't have to make your stitches this big, I'm doing it so that you can see. So I've come up further down the right hand line inside the loop again, and then I'm going to pull through, and that creates a little triangular stitch. So now I'm going to go back down at point C again, and that makes a loop over to the left. I'm going to come down about 2 centimetres, come up inside the loop on the left hand line and pull through, and now we've got a little triangle facing in the other direction. Go down at point D. I'm going to come down my line about 2 centimetres and come up at point E inside the loop, and then I'm going to go over to the left hand line again, go back down, no, that's point F. A, B, C, D, E, F. So come up at point F inside the loop and pull through. Now I'm going to go back down at point E again. Come down about 2 centimetres on the line inside the loop and pull through. So back down over here on the right hand line, down about 2 centimetres, up inside the loop, and when you want to finish off you can either hop over on the right, or you can, we've started with an open V here, so we can put a little stalk on this side if you want to, or we can just carry on until the end of the line. I'm running out of thread, so I'm going to finish off here and just hop over that loop that I've caught and pull through, and that is double chain stitch. I'm going to carry on this line for my next double stitch, and that is a double blanket stitch. I'm going to work up just because the stitch makes more sense to me if I start at the bottom, but you can work in either direction, or you can turn your hoop horizontally. So I'm going to come up on the line, and I'm just going to make a line of blanket stitches so that they work horizontally up this line on the left. So to make a blanket stitch and making my loop again, I'm coming down diagonally. I'm going to go just past halfway between the two lines, and then I'm going to rock my needle back up on that line, making sure it passes over the working thread, pull through, and that makes my first blanket stitch. So again, I'm going to come down diagonally. Let's work them a little bit closer together. I think we might get a nice effect if I do that. Come back up on the line. If you're not sure about blanket stitch, I did explain it in a lot of detail in the bee stitches video in this series. I'll link it at the top of the screen so that you can find it easily. So we're just going to make our line of blanket stitches on the left. Try and keep them even. You can make the stems of these different lengths if you want to make kind of waves. It works really nicely with a double blanket stitch because the second line of blanket stitch is going to play with the first. So now I'm going to have to turn my hoop round because my spatial awareness is not good enough to be able to work it immediately. So I'm just going to rotate my hoop so I can work horizontally. And we're going to come up across from where that first line of stitching ended, and this time we're going to make a second line of blanket stitches that interlocks with the first. So I'm going to come down in between the prongs of that first line of blanket stitch, come up on the line and pull through. So down inside that first line of blanket stitch and up on the line, inside and up on the line. If you want to, you can make these touch, so I could make my stitch right down to meet the top of the first line of blanket stitches if you want to. This is a really lovely decorative stitch that visually ends up not looking at all like blanket stitch. So even though it's just two lines of blanket stitch worked together, it sort of loses its blanket stitchiness, if that makes sense. I should be finishing off there, shouldn't I? Let's finish it off. So you can close it up if you want to by making a stitch to meet the previous line, so you could create a little box with this, or you can leave them open. It's entirely up to you. So that is double blanket stitch. So I've got one more double stitch to show you, and it's tricky. I'm not going to pretend it isn't, so feel free to skip this one, but this one is double cast on stitch. We learnt cast on stitch in the last video in this series. I'm going to thread my needle up in a slightly different way. So I've got a double length of thread here. I've just cut a long length of thread, folded it over, and I'm going to thread both of these ends into my needle. So we're going to work with two threads. Now, sometimes you can anchor your thread by threading it up in this way, but we need to be able to get our needle off easily. So I'm just going to knot that looped end, and that's going to be my starting point. Now this is very similar to cast on stitch, but this is a double cast on stitch. So I'm going to pull my needle through, and what I want to do is separate out those two threads like that, so they're going off in two different directions. I'm going to take my needle through the fabric, rock it forward, and come out at the point where those two threads meet, like that. So I've got one thread going to the left, one to the right, and my needle coming out in between them, and I'm just going to leave that needle in place. So if you haven't watched the C stitches video, I recommend that you watch that, because that will help you understand what we're doing, because we're going to do a cast on stitch, but we're going to do a double cast on. So we're going to cast on this thread first, and then we're going to cast on this thread, then we're going to do this one and then this one. So let me show you. I'm going to take this thread, I'm going to loop it round and then hook that twist onto the needle. Pull it tight so that it goes back down to the surface of the fabric. Let me just rotate my camera so I'm not quite so low on the screen. There we go, that's a bit better. So I've cast on that one. Now I'm going to swap hands and I'm going to do the same with the other side. Now this is trickier because you're going in the other direction, but we're going to twist over, so there's a twist in the thread, it's coming out the fabric and I'm coming back down behind that thread, hook it onto the needle and pull down, back over to the left, hook over onto the needle, pull down to tighten it, over to the left, twist the thread, hook it onto the needle, pull it down to tighten it, and we're just going to work backwards and forwards like this until we start to see the magic happening. So if you can't get your head around it, you can just loop the thread. So loop the thread back on itself and pull down. You want to kind of keep these threads under a bit of tension, you don't want them to loosen off. So we're just working backwards and forwards, left and then right. Your thread does get quite twisted with this, so if you need to, you can unthread your needle, untwist the threads and then rethread them, but I'm going to try not to need to do that. Now I wonder if you can see what's happening on the needle. We're getting this little bar forming with two ridges, one either side. We want to cast on so that there's enough thread on the needle to cover that fabric that we've caught with the needle. So we want to match the length of this here with the space that we've caught onto the needle. I think I'm about there. So can you see it's like a ridge, it's a bar with a ridge either side. So now we're going to just hold on to those cast-ons. We can wiggle it a little bit. I haven't used a milliner's needle because it is tricky to thread two strands of pearl cotton into a milliner's needle because the eyes are so small, but I'm just going to wiggle it until it works its way through. It is coming. I've used a thicker thread so that you can see it, but if you use a thinner thread it'll be easier to pull off. I'm going to hold on to those cast-ons and pull the thread through, and just like with a cast-on stitch or a bullion knot, that will then fold over on itself, fold back on itself, and you end up with this little twist that's really cute. You can flatten it out if you want to, but I quite like the twist. You can exaggerate the twist. The more cast-ons you do, the more twisted it will be. So you could end up with a lovely kind of double helix stitch travelling all the way down a piece of work that you're stitching. So once your stitch is fairly flat, I'm going to go back through the fabric and pull through, and that is double cast on stitch. I'll try and flatten it out so that you can see. There you go. So we get this little bar with a ridge either side. So that is double cast on stitch. So if you like the cast on stitch idea, there's another variation starting with D, and that is called Drizzle Stitch, and it uses the cast on stitch method, but we end up with a very different kind of stitch. So I'm going to bring my thread through, and then quite unusually I'm going to take my needle off the thread, so my thread is now separate, and I'm going to put my needle back through the fabric close to where it came out. So I've got the eye end of the needle pointing up and my thread is loose, and I'm going to cast on to my needle. So again, I'm looping it around my finger, turning my finger, sliding the loop onto the needle. So under, flip my hand over, slide that loop onto the needle. So get the thread over my finger, turn my hand, slide the loop onto the needle, and each time I'm pulling that thread tight so that it sits really nicely at the bottom of the needle, and I can do as many of these as I like. So the longer the needle you use, the more dramatic your drizzle stitch is going to be. So I'm just looping, casting on to the needle. How many is too many? Let's leave it at that. So at this point I've got lots of stitches cast onto my needle, or lots of loops rather, cast onto my needle. I'm going to re-thread my needle now. Okay, so I've re-threaded my needle, making sure that last cast on stitch is nice and tight, and I'm going to hold those wraps and pull the needle through. Keep pulling until the stitch, the loop disappears at the end. And what we're left with is a little cast on stitch that is only attached at one end and stands proud from the fabric. So let me show you that again. I'm going to come up, unthread my needle and go back down. I'm going to cast on. Let's do a little stumpy one this time. So that's 7 cast ons. I'm going to re-thread my needle and take my needle back through those cast ons to make another little drizzle stitch. Now this is a beautiful way to add texture. You can use it for abstract pieces, but it would make a lovely sort of organic texture if you were doing a piece that was like a garden or a hedgerow or farmland or an allotment, something like that. You could do some lovely carrot leaves with this to suggest things growing out of the ground. It is just a lovely way to add dimension to your work. So similar to cast on stitch, but we unthread our needle and re-thread it when we've cast on, and that is drizzle stitch. If all that casting on is a little bit much for you, let's go back to something a little bit more simple before we do our most tricky stitches for this time. So I'm going to show you a Danish knot. So I'm going to come up here So this is a knot that sits on a bar and it's really lovely. It does look a little bit like a Danish pastry, can look like a little love heart on a line as well. So I'm going to bring my needle up. I'm going to hop across about 1 centimetre and take my needle back down, and then I'm going to rock my needle so that it comes up in between those 2 points. So it comes up in the middle. Hopefully you can see there. So I've come up at A, gone down at B and come up at C in the middle, and I'm just going to pull through so I've got a sort of T shape. So first of all, I'm going to loop my thread around and take it back down, not through the fabric but underneath that bar that I've just stitched, to the left of where the thread's coming up. So the working thread is this central one here. I'm going to take my needle underneath the horizontal bar to the left of the working thread and pull through. Then I'm going to loop my thread around again. I'm going to take my needle underneath that bar to the right of the working thread. This time I'm going to make sure my needle passes over the top of it. So I've looped round, slid my needle under the bar, come out to the right of the working thread but over the top of it, and then I'm going to pull through. And hopefully you can see what I mean about the little heart. I've got a loop on the left and a loop on the right. My working thread is coming out in the middle, and I'm just going to hop over that loop that the working thread is on top of and pull through, and then we get a teeny tiny little heart. I wonder if I can get a bit closer. There we go, that's our little Danish knot. Let me see if I can do one again working that closely. So I'm going to come up at point A on the left, hop across to point B and bring my needle up in the middle at point C, so in line with those other 2 points, like that, and I make this little T-bar. I'm going to take my thread round to the right and slide underneath that bar on the left of that working thread. So I'm making a loop over the bar like that. Then I'm going to come round to the right again, slide my needle underneath the bar, this time to the left of the working thread, but I'm going to pass my needle over the top and pull through, and that creates my little heart shape. Then I'm going to hop over, so my thread, I hope you can see, is above that loop that I've just made. I'm going to hop over the loop to make my knot stay in place, and that creates that little heart shape. So I'll do one more up on the left. Oh, pull that a bit tight. Hop across to the right and come up in the middle. You want the bar sitting above your thread. Loop round to the right and slide under the bar to the left of the working thread. Loop round to the right, underneath the bar to the right of the working thread, and pass the needle over the top of the working thread. Hop over the loop, and that anchors that stitch in place. So that is the Danish knot, a little love heart on a bar. Super cute. Okay, this is the trickiest one we're going to do. This is called diamond stitch, and actually there's no real trickiness. There are just a lot of steps that have to be done in a particular order. So I've drawn myself 2 parallel lines, and then I've just put some dots on to help me space my stitches. So I've got 1 dot here, I've got 1 horizontally across from it and 1 just below, and then I've got pairs of dots working my way down, and I'm hoping that once I've got down to here I'll have got my eye in and I'll be able to do it by eye. So we're going to start, this is called diamond stitch. We're going to start by coming up at that top left dot on the left hand line, and I'm going to go down on the other side of the line horizontally across, and I'm going to come up just below it on that second dot like that. So I've got a bar and the thread coming out below it. I'm going to loop my thread so I'll make a letter Z or Z depending on where in the world you're from, and then I'm going to loop my thread back round over the top, and I'm going to slide my needle underneath the bar, underneath the diagonal, and over the top of the bottom bar of the Z, and I want to pull through, and that should form a little knot on the right hand side there on the line. Okay, that's step one. I want to make my letter Z again, and I'm going to repeat that process, coming down underneath the horizontal, underneath the vertical, and over the top of the bottom of the Z. This time when I pull through I want to pull over to the left, and that's going to form, just want to make sure it forms tightly, a little knot over on the left hand side. Okay, so same process twice, we've made a knot on each bar. Then I'm going to go down just below my starting point on the left hand side, and that will anchor that knot. It's a little bit like a cartoon bone, so we've got a knot on either side of a bar. Now I'm going to come down my left hand line a little bit to my next pair of dots and bring my needle up on the line. I'm going to loop my thread over to the right and then over to the left, and I'm going to repeat that process again. So I'm going to go down through the bar, underneath the bar, so not through the fabric, under the bar, under the diagonal of the Z. Maybe it would be easier if I moved it out of the way like that, and then over the top of the bottom of the Z. So I want to pull it fairly tight so that it all anchors as it should, and that's going to form a knot at the centre of that bar. I'm now going to go down on my little dot over here. Let's get that thread out of the way and catch a little bit of fabric. So I'm going to come up just below it, just like I did the first time. So I've caught a little bit of thread, I'm going to pull through. So now I've got almost like a skull and crossbones without the skull. So that was my first bar, I've caught that knot in the middle, and now I've come over to the right and caught a bit of thread, and we're going to make our Z again. So we're going to go back over to the left, loop it round to the right, and I'm going to come up and I'm going to ignore that first bar now, we're just working with these two diagonals. So I've looped my thread to the left, back to the right, I'm going to come down and go underneath the bar, underneath the diagonal of the Z, and over the top of the bottom, pull over to the left, and that creates a knot over on the left. So now we're back almost at the point we're at with this one, so I'm going to take my thread to the left and then to the right. I'm going to take it back round to the left and over the top, and then I'm going to go under the bar, under the next bar, and over the next bar. And this time I'm going to pull over to the left, and that makes the knot appear over on the left hand line. I'm going to go through the fabric to anchor that, and then come down on the left hand side to my next pair of dots. So now I'm going to loop left, right, back round over the top, go under the horizontal bar, under the next bar, and over the top through the loop. Keep everything under tension so that the knot forms in the middle. And then we go back over to the right hand side and hook a little bit of fabric. So this is slow and steady wins the race. So loop to the left, loop to the right, over the top, and we ignore what's gone before now. We're just working with these two diagonals here. So we go under the right hand diagonal, under the first loop, over the second loop. Pull over to the right to make the knot form. So now over to the left, over to the right, round, over the top again, under the left hand bar, under the next bar, and over the top. Try not to catch the thread. Try to keep my hands out of the way for the video. Pull through, over to the right, and that forms the stitch, forms the knot over on the right hand side. Down through the fabric, just below that knot, and come down to the left of the line. So over to the right, over to the left, over the top, under that horizontal bar, under the next bar, and over the top of the loop, and keep pulling, pulling, pulling until the knot forms at the centre, and then we're back to the start again. So we're going to catch a little bit of fabric, left, right, over the top, under, under, over, pull over to the left, left, right, over the top, under, under, over the loop, pull over to the left, through the fabric, down the line, left, right, over the top, over, sorry, under the bar, over the bar, and pull over to the right hand side and catch some fabric, and we're back to the start. And you just keep working like that all the way down the line. So I've stitched a little bit further, and hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea. It's a little bit wobbly purely because I'm working under a camera and I can't quite see as well as I would if I was holding the hoop up in front of me, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of what diamond stitch looks like. So that's diamond stitch. So I thought it'd be fun to show you one more thing, and that is a Dorset button, and I've just got a key ring, like a split ring here. Anything like this will work. You could do with it being fairly rigid, so I was going to do a rubber washer, but I think it's just not going to take the strain very well and won't end up circular. And I've got a huge great long length of thread here. If I run out, it's not the end of the world, but ideally you want enough to make the whole thing. Now these split rings are quite handy because you can trap the end of your thread underneath the split, so it makes it a little bit easier to work with. And I'm told that if you put a bead on your thread it won't knot up as much. I'm not going to do it. I just don't want any more moving parts to factor in. So what I'm going to do is a blanket stitch all the way around this ring. So I'm going to take my needle through the ring and over the top of the working thread, and I want to just catch in that end. So I'm just going to make sure that loop I've just made, I've got my tail going through that loop, and I'm just going to pull it tight so that it sits alongside the beginning of my stitch. There we go. So that's my first blanket stitch over the ring. So I'm just going to do that again, through the ring, over the top of the loop. Make sure it sits up against the previous stitch, so it will want to hop over the top. Just make sure it sits next to your first stitch, and we're going to keep going until that ring is completely filled. Through the ring, over the top of the loop that I've just made. Make sure the loop goes over my tail and sits alongside the previous stitch. So I'm just going to work all the way around that ring until it's completely covered, just putting blanket stitches over the ring. Okay, I've worked my way all the way around, and that's just the lump where the split ring splits, so it is better to use a solid ring, but I couldn't find them, so I'm going with this. Now if you want to, you can turn the ridge to the inside, so there's a ridge going around the edge. You can turn it to the inside of the hoop if you want to. I'm just going to leave it where it is, and what I want to do is wrap my ring to create some spokes. So I'm going to go down the back to the bottom, so I'm going to go straight across the bottom and back up again, and then this time I am going to create a spoke that goes off in a different direction, and again, so I'm making a bit of a star really, like that, and then on the way back I'm going to come up through some of the spokes and pull tight, and what I want to create is a star around a central point. It's kind of like a wheel with lots of spokes going off it, so I'm just going to put in some loops over the centre to catch all those spokes together like that, and I want to make it fairly central. So here we go, you can put more spokes on if you want to. So now we're going to backstitch essentially, so I'm going to come up through the spokes like that. I'm going to go back over, so I'm in between these two here, so my working thread's in the middle. I'm going to go over the top of the one to the right, underneath the one to the left, and pull through, and if I pull up, that's going to put that stitch quite close to the centre. So I'm going to go turn my ring around, go back over the one to the right, so my thread is now in this space here. I'm going to go back over the one to the right, up under the one to the left, and pull through, turn my ring. So I'm now in this space, so over the right, under the left, and pull through. And if I'm always pulling into the centre, I'm going to get a better finish. So over the right, under the left, and pull. And I'm just going to keep going like that until you can see the effect that is created. So I hope you can see what's happening here. This isn't the most fine example of a Dorset button I've ever made, but what is starting to happen is that because we're looping back over each of the spokes, these little ridges are starting to form along those spokes, and that will just continue out to the outside edge of the button. And there are loads of different ways of making Dorset buttons. You can make little trees, you can do all manner of designs on the inside of them, but this is the most straightforward one, and it is quite repetitive, it is quite time consuming, but they are so beautiful when they're done. It really is worth all the time, and they make a beautiful addition to a piece of slow stitch or a book. They're a really great way of fastening a book. They were originally made as buttons for coats and whatever, decorative buttons. I've made really large ones in the past, made out of bangles that I've wrapped, and you can change colour as well. So if you run out of thread or want to change colour, you just slide the needle down one of the spokes wherever you're up to and hide the end inside all those wraps, and then you come up along the next spoke and carry on as though nothing ever happened. So you bring a new thread in along the next spoke. And so there's my kind of scruffy Dorset button. I've rushed it a little bit, but hopefully you get the idea of how to do it. So that is our set of D stitches. We've done a detached chain, detached fly, detached Wheatear stitch, double chain, double blanket, and we did a double cast on stitch, drizzle stitch, Danish knot, diamond stitch, and the Dorset button. So I hope that gives you some ideas for your D page in your stitch alphabet sampler if you're making it, or just some ideas for stitches that you can use in other slow stitch projects. So love to see your work. If you have a go at any of these, please do tag me at Feather Stitch House, and if you are making the stitch alphabet sampler book, do use hashtag Feather Stitch House A to Z, and that way I'll be sure to see your work. Thanks so much for watching, have a great week and enjoy playing with some new stitches beginning with D. See you next time. Bye!